The scriptures today are filled with references about fear. Jesus mentions it 3 times in the gospel that Deacon Paul just proclaimed. And a few years ago, in preparation for a Christmas homily, I did a kind of survey of emotions in the Bible, and the one that won hands down was fear. More than any other time it's mentioned. All the angelic visitors are always saying, do not be afraid. They say it to Mary, they say it to Joseph, they say it to the shepherds. Again and again, they say, do not be afraid. We all have our fears. Just Google phobias. You'll come up with a long list. Arachnophobia, fear of fighters, agoraphobia, fear of open places, claustrophobia, fear of tight places, germophobia, fear of germs, not Germans, that's Germanophobia, or substitute any other nationality, Anglophobia, Francophobia, for all of them, xenophobia, fear of strangers. I have my own fears, I'll admit. I hate driving over the Skyway. Grand Island bridges are bad enough. I suffer from a mild case of gephyrophobia, fear of bridges. And also, I almost passed out a couple years ago here, so it's asthenophobia, fear of fainting, or maybe asthenomassophobia, fear of fainting at Mass. But then the one that's really most pervasive in my life, not germophobia or Germanophobia, Jeremy-phobia. That's true. All right, my confession. So what are your fears? What are your deepest fears? Are they something like that, a spider or whatever it might be outside of you? Sometimes those fears are inside, aren't they? They're not fears of things outside. Maybe fear of rejection or fear of being misunderstood or fear of looking foolish or fear of being alone or fear of being bullied or fear of being abused. All of those things that can affect us. Jesus mentions fear 3 times in this gospel passage. This gospel passage is a kind of pep talk because he's getting ready to send out the disciples on their first mission here in this gospel from Matthew. And so he's giving them some advice, and he knows that everybody's not going to receive them with open arms. So he's giving them some advice when they run into resistance, when they run into indifference, when they run into hostility and rejection. He wants them not to be afraid. We hear that also in Jeremiah, because Jeremiah is surrounded by people who are persecuting him, and yet, in spite of that, he knows he has to proclaim God's word. There's nothing to be afraid of because God is on his side. And the reason why Jesus is giving us this pep talk, as well as the pep talk to his disciples, is that he wants us not to shut down, not to pull back, because that's what fear does. Fear distances us. Fear removes us from the situation. Fear locks us in on ourselves. Fear paralyzes us. And Jesus wants just the opposite. Jesus wants us to reach out and to be engaged with the world, to be engaged with those we meet, to be engaged with those things that need to be changed. We are being sent forth as his first disciples were to proclaim this call for the world to change, a transformation that first must take place in ourselves. We have to shed those fears. We have to stop being afraid so that we can be the vehicles by which the good news is proclaimed to the world. Nothing good comes from fear. It's destructive. The scriptural commentator Agnes Camille wrote this. She said, "It is pretty common nowadays at times it feels like someone has murdered the soul of America while no one was looking. We are a nation shuddering in an environmental soup of crises. We live in fear that is stoked by every news crawl, renewed by every banner headline. And as Pope Francis points out, fear makes us cruel. The Pope says that fear is what drives a community to build walls, to deny the other, and to abandon the poor." In other words, fear locks us in on ourselves, makes us paralyzed, and makes us label the other as the enemy. We have enough resources in this country to feed everyone. No one should go hungry. Why are there children who are starving? Because we're afraid. We're afraid to share. We're afraid to share because if we share, we might not have enough. We're afraid to share because maybe if we share, we're going to make them used to getting free things, and they won't be motivated. We have all of our rationale. We can come up with as many reasons, but basically all of our mistakes are rooted in fear. But we can't just look at the country. We have to look at ourselves. We have to look at the church. And everything that the Pope says about an effect that fear can have on a nation can also be said of the church. Just this past couple weeks, we saw that in striking actions, opposite actions. One bishop in Springfield, Illinois, just came out with a very strong dictate to his priests and to ministers that funerals cannot be celebrated for people in gay marriage. Not only should they be denied communion, but they can't even receive Christian burial. At the opposite end of the spectrum, Joseph Cardinal Tobin in Newark opened his cathedral to gay, lesbian, and transgender people and had a mass celebrated for them as he welcomed them as sisters and brothers. One motivated by fear, the other motivated by courage and love. And that's what we're called to do. We're called to act upon this with courage and with love. We're called to recognize that as difficult as whatever situation we may face, we face it not alone, but God is with us. As St. Paul said, if God is with us, who can be against? No forces are greater than these. Oh, there's still battles to be fought and battles to be won. Several years ago, preaching at Easter, I came up with a brilliant sermon. Ron Martin was playing a piece by a French composer that was written for the armistice after World War I, and Father Pat's mother had this lovely flag in her living room, and it was from her brother who died in that war, because of that war. And so I built this sermon on the fact that the war had been won, but his grandmother said, there'll be no celebrating in this house because my son will never come home. And a couple days after the armistice, sure enough, they received a telegram that Alan had died. So I built the sermon around that. Even though the war had been won, still there were deaths, still there were skirmishes. And same thing with the resurrection. There were still to be casualties. And after I sat down, quite proud of myself, Father Pat leaned over and said, he died of pneumonia. Well, he did contract that in the war, so I felt I was vindicated. But the point is this: yes, the resurrection has happened, but the world still has to be transformed by us. We are being sent forth now like those first disciples, and Jesus gives us this encouragement: do not be afraid. No matter what you confront, do not be afraid, because you are not alone. God is with us. And if God is with us, who can be against? Let's stand and profess our faith. I believe